This is the first Maurice Bloch seminar of the new academic year. My name is David Blane. I'm a clinical research fellow in general practice and primary care in the institute here, and I'm deputy theme lead for the determinants of health and health inequalities theme. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Daniel Nettle. Professor Nettle is Professor of Behavioural Science and Research Theme Lead for Behavioural Sciences and Psychology at Newcastle University. He did his PhD in anthropology at UCL and continues to do research which is truly interdisciplinary, covering a range of topics related to behaviour, society and health. The title of today's seminar, as you can see, is Seeing People in Poverty as Rational Actors. So I will hand over to you now, Daniel.
Thank you very much, David. I'll start slightly gently because there might still be people coming in. I hope that you can all hear me, but of course I have very little feedback on that score. So I hope someone would make it known through the chat if I'm inaudible or anything like that. But anyway, it's really lovely to be invited to this seminar. I'm only incredibly sad not to be traveling up to Scotland to give it in Glasgow. And I think we're all feeling around this time, that this is becoming more and more difficult. The sort of acute response is giving away to the chronic stress of this world. I think we're all finding it really difficult not to be able to see each other and to meet together. So I'm really sorry not to be in Glasgow today. But I was very delighted to receive this invitation. And one of the reasons is I wanted to look back really on a research theme that I've been developing in different ways for a while, and making notes for giving this presentation. I realized that the first go at this idea, which I'm going to talk about today, I'd really had in a paper that I must have written in about 2008 that was never published. It went to a journal, but the journal and the paper disagreed with one another, and it remained in draft form. But it was sort of interesting to think, actually, this is 12 or 13 years when I'm trying to say the same kind of thing in slightly different ways. Tentatively at first, and I think with increasing clarity about what the idea is and why I think it matters, and in general with really no visible impact on the world whatever. But anyway, it's very nice to be here and get a chance to say it all again, and hopefully maybe convince one or two of you that it's of interest. So the basic idea that I want to talk about today is really that we should see people who are living in poverty as exactly as rational and exactly as likely to make good decisions as anybody else. And I'll try and explain specifically what I mean by that, why it matters, and why it might be different from some of the ways that we tend to think in disciplines like psychology and public health. Okay, now can I advance my slides? Yeah. Okay, so people who live in poverty behave in really different ways from people in the same countries who have greater affluence. The differences are often huge. They dwarf the difference between countries. The variation within country between the poorest people and the richest people in behavior is often much larger than the differences between countries, though those differences are also real. And this is obviously something we need to think about and understand, whether our perspective is basic explanation or improving population health. So, for example, the poorest people within Britain have start their families at a much earlier point in their life, maybe a decade earlier. And if you're poor, you're very much more likely to have a baby when you're still at school or a very young adult. So the sort of teen pregnancy phenomenon is exactly a behavior of poverty. Similarly, people living in poverty eat really different stuff from people in affluence. This is a restaurant called Pizza Addict, which is just about 200 meters from my house. You can feed a family of 4 for £10 here, which is not to be neglected. I don't say that it's great, but this is something you can do. And the people you find going in there, are generally very poor, and a lot of the behaviors we think of as unhealthy, eating sugary, sugar-sweetened beverages, sugary fatty foods, these are behaviors predominantly of people living in poverty. Similarly, there are lots of kind of assays that psychologists are interested in, like delay of gratification. Would you have, one marshmallow now or two marshmallows after a delay? Where you find these socioeconomic differences, that people living in poverty might be more present-oriented. They might be more interested in kind of immediate gratification and things like that. And these are very interesting basic patterns to explain, quite apart from their health implications and their sort of implications for how we think about making society a better place. I'll come on to more of the implications at the end. So what I want to do today is kind of talk about a view of these poverty-related behavioral differences that I've been developing and arguing for over the course of a decade or so, and some of its implications for when we think about population health. Before I go any further, I just want to say where this view comes from and what the kind of sources of inspiration are for it, because they are a bit different, I think, from the normal way of thinking in either psychology or in epidemiology and public health. So the first source of inspiration, I think, that is kind of interesting from this point of view is the discipline of economics. So economics is obviously very attuned to the idea that people at different points in the socioeconomic spectrum behave in different ways. But it tends to have a rather different outlook on that than you find in psychology or in public health. So I'm going to give you some examples. For example, the work of Gary Becker, very prominent economist. I'm citing here his work about crime, which is unfortunate. I'm not wanting to suggest that people living in poverty are also criminals. I'm just saying, I'm taking the inspiration of his crime example to sort of show you how that works and why it's a rather different way of thinking. So psychological approaches to crime had by and large said, there must be something wrong with the criminal brain. Maybe people have got underdeveloped frontal lobes or, phrenological bumps in various bad places or, neurotransmitter imbalances, that kind of stuff. So the sort of psychological approach to say, well, the brain's gone wrong. And when people commit a crime, that's obviously a bad idea. The brain's gone wrong. What can we learn about it? And Becker, what Becker says instead is maybe people who commit crime are just as rational as anyone else, right? But maybe we'll just use a rational actor approach and say, well, maybe they do it because they decide to, and maybe they do it because the payoffs available to them through legitimate activity are not particularly attractive, and so the opportunity costs of going for crime instead are not very big, and maybe they factor in things like the probability of apprehension and so on. And he says, well, actually, you can get quite a long way with that, assuming that people who commit crime are doing so just as rationally as when I choose one brand of washing powder over another. And he actually goes on to, some quite radical examples. He says, why would you divorce? Why would you become addicted to a substance? And he says, well, all of these things, rather than just assuming the brain's gone wrong, we can mount an argument where, under certain assumptions about what you derive utility from and, the alternative sources of utility that you have in your life, it could be perfectly rational, for example, to become addicted to something. He says, as long as certain conditions are met. And the point about these theories is I'm not necessarily a huge fan of the kind of rational actor framing. I think it assumes a sort of very narrow and kind of unitary account of human motivation, which I think is simplistic. But what I really like about this is he looks at people who do sort of stigmatized behaviors, and rather than saying, well, their brains have just gone wrong, says, well, maybe they're just people like you and me, just decision makers, but they face a different set of decisions. Their environment is different, so they have a different set of options to choose from. And I find that an incredibly powerful and distinctive perspective compared to some of the other ways we think about these things. So I'm not necessarily endorsing the details of his argument here, but just to say that was a source of inspiration to me. Second source of inspiration is behavioral ecology, the study of animal behavior in its natural environment. So one of the things I've done in my career is work on European starlings, a ground foraging bird. And something we see is that in the spring, the starlings really like to eat invertebrates that live in the roots of grasses. That's what they really like. But if they can't get those because it's very dry and the ground becomes too hard to probe in, they start to eat all kinds of other stuff, right? They'll eat grains, they'll eat pig pellets from pig farms, they'll eat all of these kind of things. And no one in behavioral ecology says, oh, these starlings, you know, they really need an education thing in that pig pellets are really not very good for you if you're a starling. And maybe we ought to put like labeling on the pig pellets to say, you know, high in fat and sugar, or in this case, low in protein, which is the problem for a starling. Nobody in behavioral ecology says that. What they just assume is that actually the starlings are doing the best they possibly can given the set of options that exist, right? And that's a different perspective. You're not saying the decision maker is bust, you're saying the decision maker faces a certain menu of environmental possibilities, and we've got to understand why these starlings under this particular circumstance of dry weather choose the option that they do. Similarly, you know, things like dropping dead, failing to look after your body so that it senesces and you drop dead might seem like a really bad thing to do. It might seem like the system is broken if you senesce, but actually there are very long-standing arguments in evolutionary biology that actually not looking after your body perfectly might be an extremely adaptive thing to do if it allows you to do some other stuff, like getting more reproduction done early in your life. So what I like about this behavioral ecological perspective is we don't look at the behavior of individuals in harsh environments and say, oh, they've got it wrong, they need re-education. We say, look, if you really understand the set of environmental trade-offs and environmental possibilities that they're facing, their behavior actually makes a whole lot of adaptive sense. And that also is a bit like the perspective I'm going to outline today on the behavior of people in poverty. So those are just two sources of inspiration. The structure of my talk, I'm going to give you 3 examples to do with, I've already kind of trailed these, to do with age of childbearing, to do with diet, and to do with preventative health behaviors. And then I'm going to speculate a little about the causes of the ways of thinking we have about the behavior of people in poverty and the implications of the view that I've outlined today. And then hopefully there'll be some time for some questions. Okay, age of childbearing. This is something I worked on for really a long time. It was very topical in the sort of years of the Blair government, the teenage pregnancy strategy. People were very interested in this idea that the rate of teenage pregnancy was this kind of social indicator of how Britain was doing, and you know, there was a big national strategy to kind of get that rate down and so on. So the first thing that I showed, but many other people have shown it as well, is that age at first childbearing really closely tracks poverty. So here I've divided data for the whole of England by deciles of what I'm calling neighbourhood quality, but it amounts to neighbourhood socioeconomic status. So how rich are the people in that neighbourhood, roughly speaking. And what I'm showing on the y-axis is the average age that women have their first child. And you see that there's a really marked gradient, right? So having children early, having children in your early 20s or earlier is really a pretty strong marker of living in poverty. And then the richer you get up to a point, the more you delay. So this is a consistently environment-linked behavior. Okay, so when we think about the teenage pregnancy strategy, what we're thinking about really is changing the behavior. You know, if you feel that that's a metric you want to get down, you're talking about changing the behavior of people who live in the poorest parts of the country. So British women start their reproductive careers earlier in poorer communities. Now, there's a kind of assumption that goes around in the literature on teenage pregnancy that this is always a mistake, right? That no one of school age or you know, as a young adult would sort of deliberately want to have a baby. And that therefore, you know, they must be doing this because they don't know about contraception, or that, you know, they just don't really understand the consequences of their behavior and things like that. In fact, I don't think that's probably right. It might be right for some people, but it's probably not always right. This is a study that we did some years ago where, as it happened, in the National Child Development Study, which is an ongoing longitudinal study of British women, girls have been asked at the age of 16, what do you think's a good age to have a baby? What do you think's an ideal age to have a baby? And actually, people are pretty good, right? They pre-register when they think an ideal age would be, and they generally get it. That's generally when they do have their first baby, within a year or two, right? So what you're seeing on this graph is along the horizontal axis, what age they had said would be ideal to have your first baby at the age of 16, before any of them were pregnant. and then the age at which they actually did have their first baby. And first of all, there's a really good mapping. So people who think it's a good idea to have a baby about 20 or 21, they end up having a baby earlier than people who think it's a good idea to have one 26 to 30. But also the people who end up having their babies really young really wanted to. At age 16, they said that they thought this was the ideal thing to do, right? In fact, those who really want to have a baby at 16 or 17, their problem is that not that they end up having their baby too young, is that they don't have it quite as young as they would have liked. They would have liked it even younger. Like girls who get pregnant at 18 were generally trying for 16 or 17, but didn't, the circumstances didn't align and they overshot by a year. So the idea that this is always a mistake, teenage pregnancy is always a mistake, just doesn't really seem to fit with the little bit of data that we've got about British women. So generally speaking, people start their families, not every individual, but on average at about the time that they thought that they might want to. Okay. So then there's the question of, would it always be a mistake to have a baby when you yourself were still very young? Well, obviously it eats into the kind of other things you can do, but on the other hand, you're really fertile when you're young, and actually, you have fewer obstetric complications by and large when you're young. A lot of the health problems in our society are to do with the fact middle-class people delay really a long time, and that causes problems of its own sort as well. So I sort of did an interesting calculation. One of the things we know is that healthy life expectancies are much shorter in communities where people are generally poor, right? So they're well over a decade shorter than they are in the most affluent parts of England. So I thought, well, that's sort of interesting. Let's use the known facts about healthy life expectancy in communities of different levels of affluence and say, what age would I need to start in order to satisfy some reasonable heuristic? And the reasonable heuristic I settled on was, what age would I need to start? What's the latest age I would need to start, such that I could expect to still be in good health when my oldest grandchild is 5, right? That's a totally reasonable, everyone would say, do you still want to be in good health when your grandchild is 5? Most people would say, well, yeah, that seems a good idea. That seems like a thing I would rationally want. So that's a reasonable heuristic. How early do I need to start to still expect on average to be in good health when my oldest grandchild is 5? And of course, that's going to be earlier for women living in poor communities because they haven't got as long. Actuarially, that is true. So I plotted that ideal age that you would need to target to satisfy that heuristic. And then I looked at what people actually did using various sources of data. And what you see here in the line is the age that you would need to start to satisfy that rule. And the black points are the age at which women living in different deciles of the socioeconomic spectrum of England do actually start. And you see there's an extremely good fit, right? So if women in the poorest neighborhoods start having their children at 22, that's because actually their healthy life expectancy is only about 50. So if they're going to start at 22 and their daughter starts at 22, then their heart health is going to be deteriorating around the time their oldest grandchild is 5, which fits the rules. So actually, this thing of having your baby younger, if you live in a poor community, is has a sort of perfectly straightforward, sensible, putative reason. I'm not saying that is the reason that people have babies when they do, but it's an interesting kind of conjunction of facts. Now you may say, well, look, even in the poorest decile, the age you should start is like 22, 23. It's not 16. And that's true, but deciles are a big thing. And some people within the poorest decile are going to be facing even worse than average conditions, and they may need to start even earlier. And then you add the general slot that if you're aiming for 22, you might undershoot, by a year or two either way, undershoot or overshoot. And actually, some girls are having their babies at 16 or 17 starts to not seem very outlandish, right? If in fact they rationally need to really be aiming for the early 20s. This behavior doesn't really seem so extraordinary. I'm not saying this is the complete story on how people schedule their fertility, but I'm just saying this is a sort of interesting kind of thought experiment in seeing women's reproductive decisions, not just as mistakes, but at things that are systematically related to their ecology and to the choices they have in their lives. So So actually, it's a pretty sensible, for all we know, on average, women behave pretty sensibly. Okay, I'll move on to my diet material. I'm working here, I'm drawing here particularly on the work of Nicole Darmon in France. So one of the things we see is that by all the kind of normative criteria, the diets of people living in poverty are worse than those people who are affluent. They eat more fats and sugars and less fresh fruit and vegetables and those kinds of things. First thing to point out is if you look at energy cost, which is euros per megajoule or per calorie of energy you get, the kinds of things we call healthy are really expensive. They're really, really expensive. So to get you know, a megajoule of energy from leafy vegetables costs you about €5. From fresh fish costs you about €4. To get it from sugar or a sugar sweetened beverage costs you a few cents, right? Orders of magnitude cheaper. If you need to get calories and you haven't got much money, you don't buy spinach, you know, you don't buy fresh salmon. What do you buy? You buy sugar, you buy pasta, you buy white bread. Okay, so just if you look at the sort of energy costs, you know, euros per megajoule, immediately you see why people in poverty might actually eat white bread, might eat jam on it, might have sugars and oils and so on, might not be so interested in their fruit and veg, you know, if that's the thing they're trying to maximize. So when we say your diet is unhealthy, what we're saying is by not spending much, by not having much money to spend, you're almost condemned to have an unhealthy diet, right? So that's just, you know, it's a pretty normative thing when we talk about kind of unhealthy diets. This is a really interesting study. I really recommend it to you. It's old now, but I still think it's incredibly valuable. I'll talk you through it, but it really makes a lot of sense of the kind of way I think about these things. So what this study did is it looked at what the average diet was of a whole load of the French population, and the average diet was so this is rather confusing, but I'll hopefully explain it as I go along. Was up in terms of the major nutrient groups, was represented at the left-hand end here. So it's, you know, that many calories per day from sweets, that many from fruit and vegetables, that many from fats, that many from cereals, and so on. And what these people did was got a lot of data on food prices and basically wrote a linear programming algorithm that tried to get as close to the average diet in this population as possible. So tried to select, so first of all, I should say that what this linear programming algorithm has to do is it has to create an isocaloric diet to the average diet. So it has to choose a set of foods that will give it the same number of calories per day as the average diet in the population, right? So the calorie constraint is fixed. And the second thing that the algorithm was trying to maximize is make it as similar as possible to the average diet that people actually have. But they then imposed a cost constraint, given the known prices of foods, on you know, on how much that isocaloric diet could cost. So you're looking for, at each cost constraint, you're looking for that diet which most closely approximates what people actually eat and is isocaloric to that. That's a bit of a mouthful. I hope it all makes sense. We can always go over it in questions. So if you've got €4.50 to spend, you can have the average diet, because that's what the average person spends. If you've only got €4 to spend, you can't afford the average diet. This is euros per day. You have to have a bit more cereals and a bit less meat, fish, and eggs. If you can only spend €3, you know, cereals has to go up even more, meat, fish, and eggs has to drop down even more, and fruit and vegetables has to drop down quite substantially. And if you've only got €2 or €1.50 to spend, you know, sweets really need to start coming up. Cereals is maxed out. Dairy has dropped out. Fruit and vegetables has dropped out, and meat, fish, and eggs has dropped down quite low. So in other words, the mere existence of a cost constraint shows that even if people wanted to have the average balanced diet, given that they need the same number of calories as an average human needs, They simply can't do it. And actually, the extraordinary thing about this paper is lots of really specific things about the diets of people living under poverty, the switch from whole grain to white bread, for example, the uptick in sweets amongst the very poorest, all of this stuff simply falls out from that one thing, which is if you're trying to do it on a tighter and tighter budget, more and more things give until in the end, your only options to get an isocaloric diet involve a lot more refined sugar, a lot less fruit and vegetables, a lot more carbohydrate. All of the things that we know are true of the diets of people living in poverty. So this is just a really powerful kind of study that says, why do poor people not eat good diets? Well, they don't have a lot of money, right? It does a surprising amount of explanatory work if you really look at this in a careful way. What that seems to suggest is that actually one of the most powerful ways of changing what people eat is simply to change the cost, either give them more money or make the prices of things lower. And there's plenty of evidence that that's true. So in randomized control trials here, for example, I've just exerted something from a more recent paper. This was testing randomized control trials of two particular price support mechanisms. FV was they gave a subsidy for fruit and vegetables, and NP was they gave a subsidy to healthy foods more generally. There were two groups in this study, and I don't want to get too bogged down in the differences between the groups. I just want to look at the overall change. So the difference between the pale bars and the grey bars are not much of interest to me today. But the point is, if you make the healthy foods cheaper, what happens? People eat more fruit and vegetables, they eat more, sometimes they eat more other healthy products, and they eat less of the unhealthy products. It just happens. All you need to change is the affordability, and actually behavior change just follows, which is interesting because in sort of behavior change in public health, there's this view that behavior change is very hard. Actually, what this RCT shows is certain types of behavior change are perfectly straightforward if you make the economic incentives right. Of course, these are just averages. Not everyone might respond to the same extent, but I think that's a really interesting point. So altering price alters consumption of foods pretty effectively. Okay, and then my final kind of example is going to be from Preventative Health Behaviours. This is a famous favourite cartoon of mine that Gillian Pepper found. And there's two guys in a war zone. One of them is lighting up, and the other one is saying, "Jesus, John, don't you listen? Sarge says drugs are dangerous." Well, there are bombs going off over their heads, right? So how many of us would really worry about the fact that drugs are a little bit dangerous if there were bombs going off over our heads? And for a long time, I've kind of had this intuition that, so a thing we know is that people living in poverty make less effort to look after their health and safety, even when doing so would actually be financially free. So, taking up free healthcare opportunities, health screening, for example, following instructions on medication, wearing seatbelts, all these things, they don't cost you anything, right? Or they cost you, actually they do cost you something, which is your time and effort. You have to be oriented towards them, but they don't necessarily have a financial cost. But we know that people in the poorest communities who, seem to take these up less. And this is sort of a puzzle, as you think, well, the people who really need to look after themselves, who most need it because they've got less buffer than anyone else, sadly, are the people who sort of least take advantage of these opportunities. And in this paper from 2010, I kind of had a go at trying to model that. The model's somewhat nerdy, but here goes. I'll try and give you a rough kind of flavor of it here. So what happens in this model is people are trying to preserve their, they're trying to maximize their overall kind of lifetime utility, right? Or fitness, depending on how you look at it. You can call it fitness or you can call it utility. That's a debate for another day, but they're trying to maximize something, which is the benefits they get over the course of their life. And bad things can happen to them in this model. And one of the things that can happen is at any point their health may irreversibly deteriorate for reasons completely out of their control, reasons they can do nothing about. So we call this uncontrollable or extrinsic mortality, and that has a certain probability of happening every year, okay? But in addition to that, so that's just a background thing, a thing that's true about their world. But in addition to that, they can also elect to devote some of their current resources to looking after themselves, right? To sort of, you know, doing preventative health behaviours that will keep them going if they don't get struck by lightning, right? So if something uncontrollable doesn't happen to them, these behaviours will prolong their life, you know, because they'll be better looked after. But these behaviours come at the very least an opportunity cost, because you have to think about them, you have to do them, you have to apply your energy to these behaviours instead of something else that you might do. So the first thing to notice is when you kind of plug together the fact that at any point you might die because something uncontrollable happens to you, or because you fail to look after yourself, looking after yourself has a much lesser payoff in a world where the probability of something really bad happening to you uncontrollably is high anyway. So that probability is M in the model. So M is 0.03. That basically says there's a 3% chance each year you'll get struck by lightning, and it doesn't matter how well you've, you know, gone for your heart screening, that's going to get you. And M equals 0.01. There's only a 1% chance of that happening. And this is just your total life expectancy as a function of how much effort you put into preventative health behavior. And as you can see, if M is 0.03, so there's a 3% chance you'll get just knocked out by something each year anyway, then actually the payoff to preventative health behavior is really rather modest. And that's because, just like those soldiers in the war zone I showed you, you can look after yourself really well, you can avoid drugs, and then you get hit by a bomb anyway, right? So the payoff of avoiding drugs versus not avoiding them is not really very big, because the chances are that a bomb would hit you before the sort of health payoff of avoiding drugs had really been realized anyway. Your investment in your future health by avoiding drugs will get wasted by the fact that the bomb will go off, okay? Whereas if the chance of the bomb going off is much less, then the value to you of making those investments is effectively greater. What this means is if you kind of work out what's the optimal amount to invest in your future health behavior, then it really depends what the rate of this uncontrollable mortality is. If that rate is high, the optimal amount you should invest in health behavior is actually less than if that rate is low. Why is that? Well, if you think about it, you know, it's a bit like saying, you know, I keep my car really clean when its engine is going to blow up after you know, 5,000 miles or something. All that effort I put towards keeping the bodywork clean actually turns out to be kind of wasted effort because the engine just blows up, or, you know, whatever, the car gets stolen might be a better analogy. So actually the care and attention I put into, you know, maintaining the cosmetic appearance of my car turns out to be kind of wasted effort. I could have been having more fun. I could have been doing something more valuable to me in the short term. And we assume there are such, you know, alternative activities for people. And instead being very focused on the future, which then turns out not to materialize because bad and dangerous things are happening in my environment, you know, means that just wasn't really a kind of rational choice. So what this paper sort of ends up arguing is it's not really surprising that people who face dangerous, threatening, you know, dangerous employment, unsafe housing, all of the things that affect people in poverty, it's not really surprising they're not so future oriented, because actually the payoffs to kind of devoting their psychic energy to the long-term future are probably going to be less on average, because you know, the sad truth is that bad things are more likely to happen to them in the meantime, that their best efforts won't have done anything to mitigate, because, you know, these are just structural things to do with living in poverty. What this kind of means is that if you have people who live in more dangerous environments, that ends up affecting them in two ways. There's a primary effect. If you live in a more dangerous environment, that's just bad. And there's a secondary effect, because that makes your behavior become less future oriented because of those primary dangers, which in turn means your prospects get worse, right? It's not that people are being irrational, they're just rationally responding to the thing they can't do anything about. But the overall consequence is there is this sort of double whammy, if you like, right? The world is bad anyway, and then that makes you fatalistic about the future, so you don't do the things that you might otherwise be interested in doing. To put that in a more positive way, if we could make people's environments safer, profoundly safer, i.e. they're less threatened by socioeconomic and other kinds of risk, there would automatically be a double benefit. Firstly, you've just made their environment safer. That's just a good in its own right. But secondly, you could predict that they would respond to that behaviorally by saying, I've got this better environment now, I'm going to kind of look after myself a bit more. So actually you would predict that spontaneously, if you improve the structural threats that affect people, they would then actually, as well as being grateful for that, they would actually start to be a bit more interested in looking after themselves and following health advice and wearing their seatbelts and all of those things that we perform interventions on. So that's a kind of powerfully positive framing of the lesson of this model, which is, when we make upstream interventions into the structure of our environments, we get this kind of double blessing, that it's a good thing to do anyway, and then people would respond to it behaviorally by behaving differently in ways that we view as sort of socially benign. I hope that makes sense. It's kind of an argument for upstream interventions, and it says if you get the upstream problems of disadvantage right, a whole lot of downstream things we might care about will probably just tend to follow, right? As people got richer, as middle-class people got richer over recent decades, they just spontaneously started to look after themselves in all kinds of better ways, right? They just, started to be more careful about their health, they started to drive more safely, all kinds of things happened. Not because they were told to, but because actually their lives were controllable and and contained much of good that then they felt that they wanted to protect, right? So in a way, this is an argument for getting the structural stuff right and everything else sort of tending to follow inevitably. Okay. So I've given you these three examples to do with age of childbearing, future-oriented behaviours like preventative health behaviour and diet. And I think what these all share is that when we tend to think about these things, there's a standard narrative, which is poor people just get stuff wrong. They just get stuff wrong. Right? They eat bad stuff. They get that wrong. They have these babies when they're young. They get that wrong. They don't think about the future. They get that wrong, right? And that seems to be a very deep and intuitive response. And what I've tried to argue in this talk is that if you really think about the lives people face, it's not so obvious that they're getting stuff wrong. Of course, some people are getting stuff wrong, but some very affluent people are getting stuff wrong. None of us is perfect. But on average, I'm not sure I'd go out on a limb to say that people living in poverty get stuff wrong more of the time than people living in affluence. I suspect the opposite might be true, right? That if you're affluent, you can afford to be a bit of an idiot because you've got a buffer. If you're living in poverty, you're on fine margins, and decisions matter, and people tend to get them right more, I guess. Not everyone gets everything right all the time, of course. So I think the first thing I want to talk about here is, why does it take people like me to point this really obvious stuff out? That people living in poverty may be behaving in fairly rational ways. Why don't we just spontaneously realize that that's likely to be true? Why is it that we have this very immediate intuition that people in poverty are just making mistakes? And I think this is really interesting. I'd like to do research on this. I think when we think about the behavior of other people, we have a kind of immediate context blindness. I'll try and explain what I mean. We don't see the true context in which a person is living. So what we do instead is we imagine a person who faces our own context, and then we come up with a reason why that person would do the behavior we're interested in. So if I think about Pizza Addict, this is about 200 yards from my house. I think, well, when would I go to Pizza Addict? Well, I'd go when I was just so stressed I was making a bad decision, because it wouldn't be a nice, enjoyable meal. Or I'd go if I just arrived in town and I didn't know any better. I didn't know that there was better food. So I'd go out of ignorance, I'd go out of stress, I'd go out of scarcity, I'd go because I was just, rushed off my feet or in an emotional state. So I'd do it. I would go to Pizza Addict, but only for a very specific set of reasons. And so when I think about people in poverty who go to Pizza Addict because it's cheap, I sort of import my reasons onto them. I say, oh, they must just not be making good decisions. They must not know any better. They must be stressed. And I don't see the true context that means that the reasons they're doing this might be a very different set of reasons to the reasons I, as an affluent person, would pizza addict. Similarly, I didn't have a child when I was 16, but if I think about me doing so as an affluent young person who was heading for university, it only would have happened as a kind of mistake, right? That's the only, that it could have happened, conceivably, but it would have happened, out of some sort of mistake or momentary aberration. So then you look at people in poverty who are doing this for quite different reasons, and you think, well, they just must be making that mistake. They must not know. They must not understand the mechanics of contraception. We just can't. We sort of fail to be responsive to their actual context, and instead we just sort of reverse engineer reasons why middle class people might do that. And this matters a lot, right? It matters that we respond this way rather than deeply and truly studying the actual context that people in poverty face. But it makes a difference that we have that context blindness and we come up with these intuitive but wrong explanations for why people in poverty do things. And why does it matter? Well, it matters for things like intervention. So when the UK came up with things like the teenage pregnancy strategy, it was all about giving people better access to contraception and educating them and, making them feel more emotionally valued so they wouldn't do such dumb stuff and all of these things. And actually, although the rate of teenage pregnancy did come down over the course of the strategy, it came down dramatically, but then it had actually been falling since the 1970s. So that was pretty much an open goal that it would continue to fall, and indeed it did. But the evidence that the specific interventions, like telling people about contraception and giving people sex education, really helped is very minimal, actually, which is not surprising because, if people were actually trying to have their babies quite young, then it's not very surprising that telling them a way that they could avoid doing that would not really be the most useful kind of intervention. And similarly, we think of things like label pizza addict, put a kind of high in sugar, high in fat thing on the door, or label the foods better. And, maybe that might have some difference at the margin, but really what you're doing is making a load of assumptions about why people are eating these kinds of foods that, as I say, are blind to their context. They're just like, well, they must be doing it as some kind of mistake, or they're too stressed to really concentrate, and so I've got to label these in really big letters. And we're not really seeing the further upstream causes. So I think what I'm trying to say in this section is the interventions we come up with are very driven by our intuitive responses to the behaviors of people in poverty. And I don't think those responses are often really rooted in the real causes of those behaviors. But if they were, we would come up with different kinds of interventions. What interventions will we come up with? Well, that's a very good question. And I think, this is a difficult area, right? So for example, with Matthew Johnson and colleagues are now working on the idea of universal basic income as a health intervention. You think, well, that's a bit of a funny health intervention. How does that compare to, labeling on high salt foods and so on? And what we're arguing is that most of the interventions that we think about in public health are far too far downstream. Labeling foods or going into schools and telling people about, the benefits of certain behaviors and so on is no good if they don't have any money and that their structural prospects are bleak. So really, if you're serious, you want to go upstream of that and say, well, make their structural prospects better. And my prediction would be a whole lot of downstream things would tend to follow from that. And then you think, well, how far upstream do I have to go? And we're kind of interested in universal basic income because we can't think of anything much further upstream, right? That's about as far as you can go, is making sure people aren't poor in the first place, or not, or at least, taking the kind of worst edges off poverty and taking the unpredictability out of economic life. You think, well, if that happened at this level, what are going to be the cascades further down the pyramid? And I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer, right? It may be that in fact things further downstream are sometimes very effective, but we at least have to consider the hypothesis that if you go far enough upstream, the beauty of it is you don't end up with dozens of little interventions, one for smoking and one for diet and one for teenage pregnancy and one for this, that, and the other. What you actually end up with is one thing, right? Which is politically transforming society. So I suppose when you start to think like this, you think about the context people live in and the ways that they might respond to it, this does become a sort of political thing that you start to say, well, if you're interested in changing behavior, you need to change the environment, and changing the environment does involve political reform to a greater or lesser extent. It's not something that you just sort of do through little nudges and things like that. Now, I know this is difficult, particularly for public health, because people in public health often say to me, yeah, but no one's kind of giving me a grant to transform society. They're giving me a grant to, like, study salad consumption, or something like that. So I can't bring about the revolution. All I can do is study this little intervention or come up with an intervention at this level, and that's fair enough. But we're social scientists, and one of the responsibilities of social science, I think, is to speak truth to power. So if we believe that this kind of stuff is important, we need to say that, and we need to remind it to people who come asking us for interventions and for ways of changing things. David's popped back onto the screen, so that screen, I'm guessing what that means is that 45 minutes is up. I'd just like to leave you with the fact that it's been fun working on this topic for the last decade, and a couple of my friends who I think are on this call today, Gillian Pepper and William Frankenhaus, and I have sort of written about some of this. And if you want to read some of my most recent integrative thoughts, well, maybe they're their thoughts rather than mine, really. But anyway, our recent thoughts, I would just point you to these two papers in particular for this view of life that I've just given you. I'll stop there and take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'll give a kind of virtual round of applause on behalf of the audience. Lots to take in there, and we've got a number of questions already. So are you okay to have a look at can you see the Q&As yourself?
Yes, I can. I'll go in order from the I'll go in order from the earliest. Hi, Katie. It's nice to see you. You wrote a commentary on one of our papers a couple of years back. I'm wondering whether so Katie says, I wonder whether the model also predicts an age-related decrease in preventative health behaviours amongst those with no children or grandchildren. So I guess what you're thinking, Katie, is that you sort of, if you have children or grandchildren, it gives you a different set of incentives to sort of look after yourself. That's a really interesting idea. I've not thought about it at all. Very possibly it does predict that. I've just never thought of it. So maybe that's something we should go away and have a think about. If it's all right with you, because we've got quite a few questions, I'll just leave it at that. We have a question from Delia. From this perspective, does it make sense to invest in educational programs in low SES communities, good teachers and so on, without investing in the larger community? Will the kids really be helped by making only their school better? I think that's a very interesting question, and I think that partly depends on your view of whether education leads to social mobility, right? So if you think that education is a way of, better education is a way of increasing community wealth over time, then I think it does still make sense. It does still make sense that that will be a primary intervention, that you make the schools better. So very possibly, it does still make sense. I have to say that I'm actually quite attracted to the alternative, which is that you just give people money, right? Unconditional cash transfers. I'm very interested in this, and I think that the evidence is that actually, once you make people just a little bit better off, just in a purely material way, I know this seems counterintuitive, then actually lots of things sort of follow, that they start to get a bit more interested in their school and a bit more involved in it and a bit more invested in it. And then actually getting the education attainment up, follows more as an effect than a cause. Though I think, both views are possible. So I think that's a great question, and I don't have a very strong answer, but I think we should at least consider the hypothesis that actually just unconditional cash transfers or redistribution are quite a good idea per se, and that other things then follow suit. Okay, Sally Wyke asks, mixed methods and participative research with people living in poverty would help make your case. Have you worked with other disciplines to do that? No, I haven't, Sally, but I completely agree with you. I mean, partly as researchers, we all end up doing the kind of research that we know and that we're comfortable with. I read that kind of research and I, agree with it and understand its aims. I might quibble with bits and pieces of the methods and with the extent to which they address the same questions that I'm addressing, but I'm totally on your side about that. So I personally don't do that kind of work. I also think that to some extent, I don't know quite how to say this, and I hope it won't rub you up the wrong way, that I mean, I'm just very quantitatively oriented anyway, and I like sort of big data sets. And I think to some extent, that plays into the assumptions of a certain kind of policymaker. So I turn up with a small qualitative study, they go, yeah, that's all fine, but we don't really, that doesn't, they tend to be quite dismissive of that. But actually coming and look, here's some quantitative, evidence, here's some, some national scale data that shows this. Actually ends up being quite convincing to that people with that particular mindset. Now, you might say they shouldn't have that mindset in the first place, and you may well be right about that. But I hope that answers your question. Carolyn Hunter asks, what factors are we considering to be the increase in extrinsic threats to people living in poverty? And I think, Carolyn, you're going on to say aren't a lot of the things like cardiovascular risk themselves the outcome of behaviour rather than just existing independently? And I think that's also a great question. Gillian Pepper, who's on the call, and I have worried about that long and hard. I can give you two kind of answers. One's a sort of statistical one. The first one is that when you look at people living in poverty, their life expectancy is worse. So you control for their smoking, that explains a bit of it. You control for their drinking, that explains a bit of it. You control for their exercise, that explains a bit of it. You control for their diet, that explains a bit of it. But you're always left with a rump that you can't explain away through their behavior, right? And if you think about it, pollution, for example, in a world in which some neighborhoods are more expensive than others, the poorest people have to live in the most polluted places. They can't do anything about it. They can't afford to live anywhere else, right? So think about, there are certain things you just cannot modify through things that are within your control. Yes, of course, some of it's behavior, but you sort of control for, or you statistically take out the things that are obviously the outcome of behavior. There's a residual that's left, and it's that residual that I think is kind of what I would call structural that I'm really talking about here. But obviously this is sort of, cause and effect are all a bit different there, difficult there, because they're so deeply entangled. And of course, the fact the other people around you might be behaving impulsively might itself be a kind of source of danger to me. So so these things are not straightforward. I'll press on though, if you don't mind. Sally asks, public health researchers have been arguing for upstream interventions for a long time. Yes, I know, you're right. If I made it sound like they haven't, mea culpa, I know they have. I just think the argument needs to constantly be redoubled because they're effective. Agreed. The problem is that they're hard to implement. Well, it depends what you mean by hard. The problem is that they get sort of political and expensive, and you have to get a whole lot of people to agree to do them, not just at the local level, but the national level, or at the very least the subnational level. And those things are difficult. So when you say hard to implement, I mean, there are lots of interventions that are hard in certain ways, like to get people to adhere to them consistently. But I think there's a particular type of hard with the most upstream ones, which is you have to kind of convince a lot of people, including voters, including politicians, including bureaucrats. And there's a whole lot of obstacles that you hit. But thank you for your comment, Sally. Rachel, who works in reproductive health, says, would it be interesting to look at women's abortion experiences in this framework as rational actors? Scottish women living in the most deprived quintile are consistently having more abortions than women in the most affluent. It will be interesting to look at abortions, ideal age for childbearing, and health in later life, to understand these reproductive choices. Yeah, so my understanding is that actually people of different socioeconomic positions have abortions at different times of their life and for different reasons. So affluent women have abortions when they're young so that they can have childbearing later at a time that better suits their careers. I think women in poverty are often having abortions at a different time, possibly when they're a bit older, for different reasons. So I do think those things all interact in a subtle way. Often abortion is about precisely finding yourself with a pregnancy at the time that it doesn't make sense given your particular trajectory through life and your particular environment. So I think there might be a lot of interesting stuff to look at there. I hope we're going to get through these. Well, let's see how we go. We'll keep going until the clock gets us. Gaia says, wanted to ask about the changes in society with more people from working class families staying on in education and whether this affects poverty and financial choices. Well, that's a big question, Gaia. I mean, it depends what you think education affects. I think one of the difficulties is that people staying on in education doesn't necessarily, it may well economically benefit people in the long run, but it doesn't necessarily do so. Particularly that one of the functions of education is partly credentialing, right? It becomes a gatekeeping function to scarce resources like graduate level jobs. If you make the number of graduates more without making the graduate level jobs more, it's not obvious that you've made prospects that much better for people who who are last in, as it were. But yes, in principle, education changes a whole bunch of things because it gives you, all kinds of payoffs for things down the line than you might otherwise have, and also exposure to different kinds of opportunities and stuff like that. So, in the long run, but the kind of poverty I'm talking about in the diet example is not kind of a lifetime poverty and trajectory. It's actually how much money you've got to spend on food this week was really what I was primarily talking about. So being in education doesn't change that overnight. Sharon says that she agrees that UBI needs to be implemented as a means to tackle inequality. And she points out that sociologists and political scientists have been arguing this for years. And yes, mea culpa if I've tried to claim that I've got some great insight that hasn't been had before me, I apologize. How do we move this forward rather than existing in an echo chamber? I mean, if I know, Sharon, that is indeed the answer. And I don't know, but it's one of those things we just seem to keep saying over and over again. I do think that maybe there are green shoots, and I think here's two ways that there could be green shoots. One is that the pandemic has changed a lot of stuff, right? People are really starting to be aware of kind of the precariousness of human life in this country and how it affects lots of different people. And I think the pandemic's kind of turned all that a bit over its head. This is a time of flux. This is a time when we've seen that the state can be effective, right? Because it's done things like, furloughed 10 million people at a week's notice. I mean, that's pretty effective state action. And, that's something that would have been politically impossible a year ago, and it just happened. So, so that's one way. And the other way, I think that there's a lot of support in society for health, and for evidence-based policy, and actually big RCTs of some of these things, will change people's minds. The people's minds we need to change are very often middle-class people, right? We're going to have to vote for it, or politicians and bureaucrats who might be intuitively skeptical about some of these things. But, I do think we can get some of these messages out there. Hamish says, how does this fit with excess calories? So talking about my diet example, because the point is that people are consuming too many calories. And, is that the problem? The first thing I would say, Hamish, if you're sort of alluding to the fact that particularly poor women are more likely to be obese, the evidence that what's implicated in obesity is the number of calories you eat is really surprisingly weak. A calorie is not a calorie is not a calorie. And people who eat isocaloric diets higher in sugars, for example, end up fatter than those who eat isocaloric, have the same activity and the same number of calories in, but get them from different sources. So a diet can be more obesogenic than another diet without containing more calories, right? And actually the evidence that poor people eat more calories is pretty weak. I mean, they sometimes do because they have more manual jobs and they're also being more physically active. But it's, the obesity crisis is not about people eating, it's not obviously about people eating too many calories. It's actually that, they might be eating the right number of calories, but in the wrong way through the wrong food groups. I think that's a whole topic for another day. So if you don't mind, we'll skip on, but I hope that sort of alluded to it. David Conway asks about price policy interventions like alcohol minimum pricing and sugar tax. Well, my general framework will predict they'd be pretty effective. And I think that's right, actually. I mean, they're actually doubly effective because they also have an incentive. They have an incentive effect on the manufacturers, right? Who just reformulate things to have less sugar in them. But actually also changing the price of things is a really, would be under my way of thinking, will be a fairly direct lever to people's behavior. I'm just going to ask David, because we've got like quite a lot more questions, David. What's your advice?
I'm happy to keep going if you are.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great.
Give it another 5 minutes, 10 minutes or so. Yeah, have a drink of water. And
Eric Eaglestrom says that I mentioned the idea that more affluent people could plausibly afford to get stuff wrong because they have more of a buffer. And he's curious about whether I have considered any ways of testing this hypothesis, i.e. that people with smaller margins, in some sense, are more prone to optimize things in general. No, Eric, it's a lovely hypothesis, and I would really like to know about it. Courtney Neal, who's on this call, has just done a master's about kind of what hungry people know about food. What do they sort of remember about food? And I think what she found is that people who are hungry were actually more attentive to information about the kind of price of food and things like that. I suspect there's a sort of parable in that when you're at the margin, you've got to know a lot of stuff, right? You've got to know that it's 3 pence cheaper, that brand than this brand, or by going around the corners to the other shop, or you've got to know that electricity is cheaper outside at certain hours or whatever. I don't need to know any of that stuff, right? So in a sense, I would strongly predict that people, more affluent people, have the luxury of not having to care about a whole range of things and possibly not even think about them. But I don't think the data on that are very good yet, and I do think that would be a great topic to work on. Emma Stewart asks, how can we engage policymakers in the areas of welfare, employment, housing, etc., with the idea that those policies are important for health outcomes? Well, I completely agree, and that's the kind of work that Matthew Johnson has engaged in which he's trying to sort of say, when we evaluate universal basic income, people have philosophical evaluations of it, they have economic evaluations of it, they think about the effect on employment and unemployment and so on. But we spend staggering amounts of money on healthcare, absolutely staggering. It's a huge chunk of the government's expenditure. And so actually, if there's some calculus of disability adjusted life years lost that we apply to a certain type of screening or a certain type of medical treatment, we should provide, make that same calculus about something like universal basic income, right? It doesn't seem like a medical treatment, but what if it were? What if it's a medical treatment, right? And then actually a very different set of kind of utilitarian calculations comes into play. So I actually think it's a really interesting thought experiment to say, I almost feel like saying, I've got an essay where I do this, and I say, look, folks, I've discovered this treatment, right? That it does all these things. It prolongs life. It, has all of these benefits. It reduces stress, and people go, oh, that's really great, And I say, well, do you think society, it's going to prolong life and reduce stress for 15 million people? Do you think it's should society spend on that? And they go, oh yeah, totally. The NHS should be spending on that. I say, yeah, it's called them not being poor. And they go, oh, I'm not so sure about that, right? And I think that's because all sorts of things start to come into play, like maybe they're poor for reasons that are their own fault, and the attribution for why they're poor in the first place, and whether they would just squander it if you gave them money and so on. So there's a whole psychology around that we need to explore. But I think it's a really interesting move to say some of these things you think of as political are actually medical interventions, or at least public health interventions. It's just a different way of thinking about it. Cleopatra asks, in low and middle income countries, fast foods and sweets are accessible for those in middle income status and higher because they have better spending power. So she's asking, Cleopatra, I'm a bit unsure what you mean about what's the justification for pizza and sweets being cheaper in high-income countries. I mean, so nutritionally, there are lots of really interesting reversals between low and middle-income countries and high-income countries. So in low and middle-income countries, the poor are thin and don't eat fast food and sweets, but the rich do. And then you have this nutritional transition where actually it's the poor who are, in higher-income countries, it's the poor who are fat and eat fast food and sweets. So everything gets kind of turned on its head. And that's a lot to do with the overall food production system, what's cheap, what the big corporations do well, what kind of access people have. People obviously not growing their own food, or they don't have access to the countryside in a particular way. So there is a very interesting inversion that goes on in the transition from lower and middle income countries to high income countries. And within many lower and middle income countries, you can see both persisting. In the capital city, it will be the poor who are fat and the rich who are thin. But in the countryside, it might be the poor who are thin and the rich who are fat. So everything gets kind of inverted, and often increasingly we see those things happening within the same country all simultaneously as social change goes on. Hamish Foster just comments that about my point about context blindness, and he says it fits with a clinical medicine point of view, where basically having the best case history, I think is what you're saying, Hamish, helps you give the best advice. So you need to empathize. Yeah, I mean, I think the concept of empathy, maybe means different things to different people. I'm really almost not talking about empathy. I'm just talking about factual knowledge of the true situations people face. And I guess that's a bit like in your clinical medicine example. That's more like knowledge of the actual fact, of the case history involved. So this thing of understanding where people are at is really, really important. Cameron says, echoes that point really. So Cameron, if you don't mind, I won't answer separately, but we'll move on. DEW, food is by historical standards extremely cheap, but comes at a huge cost. Now, this is interesting, this whole, so food is actually cheap and subsidized. So all of your, pizza addict, low-cost food is actually, the environmental cost is not really being properly internalized into that. So should a food actually be more expensive, and wouldn't that exacerbate the kind of things I'm talking about? Yeah, I think that's a really difficult one. And I actually probably prefer raising the incomes of the poor to subsidizing food, because I think subsidizing food can have all kinds of invidious effects, for example, on the environment. Raising the incomes of the poor might have environmental effects as well. They might start flying around the world, so that these things are not simple. But there's definitely a tension in the food insecurity community within which I move, between people who say, look, food is too cheap, and actually, the environmental costs are not being internalized, and people say food is too expensive, and that's why people are not eating well. And we need to think a lot about how you kind of square that circle. But I think raising the incomes of the poor is sort of an important part of that. Ahmed asks, the capitalist system is resistant to reducing the socioeconomic gap. And this is problematic in low income countries, which are transforming towards more inequity. So Ahmed, I think your point is that academia is kind of complicit in all this. That we're funded by nutrition companies, for example, and pharma, and all these people who have pharmaceutical countries. All these people have got particular vested interests in certain kinds of approaches. So is it the duty of social scientists to start entering the political arena? Well, I think social science has always been a small p political endeavor since its inception in the 19th century. And I think that the thing about being a social scientist that's distinctive, I think of myself as both a biologist and a social scientist, so I like to. I think that if you feel, the thing that's distinctive about social scientists is that they feel that the correct level of intervention is not the individual mind, or the individual neuron, or the individual neurotransmitter junction, but like something at the higher social level. That's what makes you a social scientist, in my view, as opposed to a biological one. Though I don't really believe in that distinction in any important way. But social scientists tend to be committed to analysing the broader societal picture and intervening at the level of the whole society. For example, through public policy. So I think we're in the political arena anyway, and we just try and need to not overclaim for ourselves, but also not be shy about saying things that we believe. And Esther, it's the last question I've got here. How do you think this research could affect how we understand and approach behaviour in the two major crises we're dealing with, COVID-19 and the climate emergency? Great question, Esther. I've been doing some research on COVID-19, and one of the things I see that is, I think real social change it's not kind of something that's consistently available through time. You see with what happened in the world wars in the 20th century, that sort of certain social changes that were struggling to come, like universal healthcare, like pensions and so on, then there's a world war and suddenly everything is possible. Now, I feel a bit the same about the COVID pandemic. You know, who would have thought that a Conservative government would be basically, you know, nationalising the railways and taking 20 million people onto its payroll temporarily, and would be quite happy to do all that, totally happy to do it, you know, subsidise all kinds of things. I'm not saying those were the optimal policies necessarily, but we live in a moment of change. So I really hope that something that comes out of the COVID-19 crisis is that we see that different ways of living are, you know, are possible, and different ways of governing and government spending its resources are possible. Because when the chips are really down, you know, even a Conservative government found ways of doing all kinds of things, right? So when the next time someone tells you it's just not possible to do X, you say, well, what about the furlough scheme? You came up with that in 2 weeks, right? You know, so lots of things are actually possible, it turns out, if you treat them as sufficiently urgent. Climate emergency, well, that's a difficult one. That's a really difficult one. But, you know, as I'm sure is often pointed out, the costs of the climate emergency fall on particular groups of people, and the responsibility for the emissions are not necessarily those same groups of people. That applies both between countries and within countries. So there's a fundamental inequality related issue there, which, you know, better people than me need to think about, really. I'll leave it at there, Esther, if that's all right. By my calculation, I think we're done, David, with the questions. My God, that was
yeah, well done. Yeah, 18. That must be some sort of record. Thank you so much, Daniel. That was fantastic. Really, really interesting stuff. I had several questions of my own, but I'll maybe pick them up with you later on. And yeah, we've run over by 10 minutes. So I think on that note, I'll let you catch your breath. But well, thanks again.
All I would say, first of all, it's just been a total pleasure, David, and thank you to all the people who typed their questions. And secondly, you know, I just hate the ending of these online social encounters, because I just kind of like to decompress for a moment by like just seeing you all and, you know, shaking your hands or going for a drink on Sauchiehall Street or whatever we would do. And it's just a shame that you just sort of log off and you're just left sort of standing in my office going, oh, well, that was that. But anyway, it's been a real pleasure to interact with you. So thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Dan, thanks everyone in the audience as well, and in the chat bar. And I mentioned in that as well that we have Claire Bambra, also from Newcastle University, joining us next month on the 17th of November, talking about scaling up the politics of health and place. So look forward to seeing you again then.